This is a Dauntless Media Collective podcast. Visit dauntless.fm for more content.
Producer's note: this episode contains detailed discussions of non-consensual outing, mental health emergencies, and suicidal ideation. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Full Mutuality podcast. I know it's been a while since our last episode, so we wanted to provide you with a quick update on where we've been at and say thank you for your patience as we've navigated a very busy season in our jobs, families, personal lives. Today's episode is much longer than usual, and we decided we don't want to break this episode up like we've done in the past because you're an adult and you can handle hitting pause and getting back to this later if you need to listen over a few sittings. It's a good episode. So we'll try and keep this update as short as possible.
So if you've been following any of the news in the evangelical world, you're probably aware that evangelical Christianity's biggest brand, Hillsong Church, is in the midst of a very public collapse filled with breaking news scandals hitting media outlets seemingly every single day.
Every day.
So we talked about it in our last two episodes with Janice Lagata, who talks a lot about her own Hillsong experiences and others in her podcast, God Has Not Given. So as all of the news was breaking, we actually recorded a couple more conversations with two other Hillsong survivors, Noemi Uribe and Wes Curtis.
As we mentioned in a recent episode, we just started a Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/fullmutuality. In case you're wondering, we're not trying to profit off this podcast, and we don't currently earn any revenue from what we do here. It's a labor of love to you all. We're not planning to launch any deconstruction classes, and we'll continue providing our content at no cost to our listeners and followers, but it does cost money to operate, including hosting fees, equipment costs, software licenses. So that comes out of our own pocket, and if you're able to help us out, we truly appreciate anything you can offer. You can even become our first patron, as that spot is still available.
Okay, going back a little bit. So before all of the Hillsong news hit a fever pitch in recent months, with Brian Houston's resignation, the Discovery Plus documentary dropping, we actually had recorded a conversation with Kayla Felton, who is the co-founder of Reclamation Collective, an organization that provides care and support to people who have experienced religious trauma or adverse religious experiences.
And after all of these Hillsong episodes, I think we're all going to need to hear from a religious trauma therapist.
So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already so that you don't miss out on that conversation. Now, we normally don't really preview upcoming conversations in the podcast ahead of time, but we wanted to actually bring this up because Reclamation Collective has announced their summer support groups, including one that is specifically for Hillsong survivors, which they're providing free of charge for anyone who has suffered trauma from their time at Hillsong.
Yeah, they're doing the hard work that churches are not doing to look after all those harmed. And that reason is because, of course, it's the churches causing the harm, and they don't want to take responsibility for their messes, so others are having to pick up the pieces. Unfortunately, the support group has already filled up, which isn't a big surprise. Clearly, they're meeting a really important need. But if you're able, please consider donating to the Reclamation Collective and mentioning Hillsong Support Group in your donation note. And just so you know, anything that we receive from our patrons that goes beyond what we need to operate the podcast will go towards the community, to this and other support groups offered by Reclamation Collective.
So thanks so much for listening, everyone. And now, without further ado, here is our conversation with Noemi Uribe. Hi, I'm Nate.
I'm drinking alcohol. No,
sorry.
Nate, don't do that again.
Sorry.
That needs to make it in.
This is how we podcast, folks. Sorry. It's not super wholesome all the time.
If you've been following our podcast at all, you are probably aware that we've been covering some of the Hillsong kerfuffle, I suppose, is one way of putting it. And we've had a series of episodes that have been covering what's been going on. A little backstory for myself, if you haven't listened to any of our previous episodes. I am a former member and producer from Hillsong NYC, and we I mean, I left back in 2017, so a lot of the fallout that's been going on over the last few years, I haven't really been keeping up with, like, or at least I wasn't inside the church when all of this was going on. Of course, I was keeping up with it from the outside, because how can you not when you were a part of this thing? But Noemi Uribe is a queer Latinx advocate who currently lives in Boston, and they were a part of Hillsong Boston. But before we dive into their story, we let's get a little bit of your backstory. I'm sorry. Before we dive into their Hillsong story, let's get a little bit of your backstory, maybe with regards to faith, spirituality, and so on, kind of leading up to the conversation of the hour.
Yeah. So my pronouns are she, they. I like to say that just in case there's other queer folks who are wondering, or anybody else who's wondering. I grew up in a Latinx Pentecostal church. My dad was a preacher, at one point was a pastor, and then was a missionary as well. And all of his brothers are pastors. The majority are still there as pastors. So it was a very charismatic, Pentecostal, like, should have bought a Honda kind of people. So that was really, from the time I was 5, my dad became a pastor. When I was 11, we moved to Mexico, and that's where he did more of his missionary work. And then he ended up passing away when I was 16. So a big part of my life was being in church, helping set up in Mexico, helping with the kids ministry. They would do a lot of the music ministry. So a lot of my faith, I often say, was my parents, their faith. And I kind of started gaining my own faith in college. So early on, I knew clearly a lot of things about their theology and what they believed in. And we can go into that more later of like homosexuality and churches who are more ambiguous and those who are very vocal about it, about their homophobia, which is the kind of church I grew up in, which I honestly now prefer to know their homophobia up front, to know if it's a safe space or not, in comparison to places like Hillsong. So that was a big part of me growing up, learning early on my boundaries, what I can do as a woman, or a person who identified as a woman when I was younger. Now I am non-binary, but that was a big part of me growing up, figuring out that I couldn't preach, or I couldn't be leading. I could only teach, or I can only do kids ministry, and knowing there wasn't going to be a clear future in vocational ministry if I were to want to stay. Which, after seeing what I saw with dealings within my family and like pastors, I was like, that's not a life I want. So yeah, that was like a big part of my kind of faith growing up. And then after my dad passed away, I moved back to the US, and I went to college in Arizona, northern Arizona. And there I became a part of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship.
Very familiar in Canada with InterVarsity.
Yeah.
I was a part of a Christian fellowship that was linked up to InterVarsity, and I went to Urbana, which was InterVarsity, attended many of Urbanas. So I don't know if you ever went to those.
I did. I went once. Urbana 15.
Okay. All right. So we're both Urbana alumni. I'm trying to think if I was there in 15, and which was the last one I attended before I was out. It might have been 15, perhaps. Might have been. I'm trying to think.
That was the one and only one I went to.
Wow. I definitely remember that stuff. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I was part of InterVarsity, and that was really the first time. So within
Were you on staff? Sorry to cut you off. Were you on staff at InterVarsity?
No. They wanted me to be on staff, but no. Yeah. And that was because, so I was part of InterVarsity from freshman year, I tried to go, but again, I grew up in this very Pentecostal, like, this church is the only church that will be saved kind of church. Yeah. So when I went to university and saw all these people from different denominations, it's very interdenominational.
But still very evangelical, though.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Yes.
It's clearly
Yes.
evangelical, but they say they're interdenominational because they're bringing people in. But they're not.
Yeah,
They're trying to convert.
They'll have some evangelical Catholics, at some of the stuff. And they exist. So that's very interesting.
I see them more in like the general chapter. I was part of the Latinx, the Latino Fellowship, so La Fe.
Okay.
And we were very careful about how we navigated the conversation with Catholic and Protestant Latino students. Because Catholicism and Christianity, or Protestant Christianity, have a really big conflict. And throughout history and throughout Latin America, there's a huge conflict. It divided my family. My grandparents from my mom's side were Catholic. And when my mom converted to Protestant Christianity, they kind of almost disowned her because of that. So we would see that within a lot of students, Latino students, who would know they were from different sides of the spectrum of Christianity, and that was not a fun conversation. So La Fe was a place to bring people together and bridge the gap. So while the general chapter was doing very evangelical, interdenominational with quotations, La Fe was doing more of bridging the gap with Catholic and Protestant Latinx students. And I was a leader within that. So, yeah.
I feel like I relate, like, not just on the Urbana side, but I also come from a Pentecostal background, and mine's Italian Pentecostal. So when you speak of that Catholic, like in Italian culture, if you were Christian, you were Catholic or evangelical, and Pentecostal specifically. You were an Italian Pentecostal or you were Catholic. Those are the two things. And within our Pentecostal, because I grew up Italian Pentecostal, within our church, that navigating the Catholic roots, because everyone was Catholic before they became evangelical, was so contentious, and there was so much cultural stuff involved in that. So I'm totally tracking with you on a lot of this. Sounds very familiar.
Yeah. And similar things happen in Latin America. And now when you hear like places like Brazil that are having like the biggest Pentecostal movements that are growing there, I think it's the number one country in Latin America where Pentecostalism is growing the fastest. You can start seeing that within families as well, because Catholicism was there before due to like colonization. So,
right.
Yeah, it's a big part of it. But yeah, so I was a part of InterVarsity, and that was a big part of my faith change. Because I started questioning a lot of things. InterVarsity is very keen to people asking questions and manuscripting scripture. Right. And why does it say this? And for me, growing up, my dad allowed us to ask questions at home. We would have questions about science and like theology, and he welcomed it all into the home. But when it came to having more in-depth conversations about certain topics, it was sometimes it wasn't welcomed, or it was like, this is the answer and you either take it or you leave it. So when I became part of InterVarsity, that was like a safe space for me to ask all the questions. And I finally had someone else I could go to ask all these questions, because my dad had passed away.
All right.
So that was really eye-opening for me to be able to like learn about, at least ask all the questions I was looking for within theology. And then I was also minoring in world religions or comparative religion.
Okay.
Because again, I was like trying to fill the void of not having my dad to go to for questions. So I started minoring in religion, and I started learning about the history of religions in general, but more specifically Christianity within Latin America, and then evangelical Christianity, and theology, and words like eschatology started coming up, or fundamentalism.
Where'd you go to school, by the way? It wasn't a Christian Bible college, so you were getting actual...
No. Okay, it was a public school.
I mean, getting a worldview that's actually more objective is harder to get in a Bible college that's trying to reinforce, this is the right way, right?
No, and I knew early on because I did apply to a Christian school for college, but then I thought about wanting to get a worldview. I had friends who had only gone to Christian schools, and they didn't know how to talk to people just like on a regular basis, or like have an actual debate with someone, or just hold a conversation without telling them you're wrong, like actually listening. And
so
that was
you wanted your view to be challenged. Like you wanted yourself to know how to debate and discuss. Even though you were coming from that evangelical position, you were wanting that pushback. Yeah.
And in the home, my dad allowed that. Outside of the home, we couldn't do that. So it was like, and he pushed us towards wanting to have those types of conversations. Like when we would go somewhere, my dad would have to go preach somewhere, and the pastor there would say something that was not okay. We would hold it until we were in the car ride home. Be like, he said this, I don't like that. Can we digest that? And he was really good about having those conversations with us and saying, yeah, I didn't agree with it either. So why don't we agree with it? And then we would talk about it.
So he set a foundation of setting you up for having really rich conversations that kind of allowed you to ask questions about what, not to take whatever is being said by a pastor as an authority for just like take it for cash, like it's legit and you should believe it.
And he would tell me like pastors are human. We make mistakes too. Like I'm not perfect at all. And he showed me his flaws, and we would talk about that. So coming from a place where a pastor or a leader in the home or a missionary, someone in the pulpit preaching could be a human. And he would be very open about that with the people he spoke with. That was something that was very different when I went to a church like Hillsong, where things were getting a lot of pushback. But we can get to that later. But yeah, so I was part of InterVarsity. And in 2015, after I went to Urbana, I started questioning if the church that I attended, which was that of the one I had grown up in, was the one I wanted to stay in. Was that a place where I wanted to thrive or like have my family? I already didn't agree with a lot of things theologically. So I had this like come to Jesus moment there at Urbana, like everyone does, because, emotional music and they're trying to get you sleep deprived. So it all happened, and I spoke to one of my mentors there, and I told her that I was feeling like it was time for me to confront the pastors where I had grown up in and like step away and leave officially. That was one thing that my parents always did teach us of like, if you're going to leave somewhere, don't just like disappear, like be upfront about it and go tell them at least. They appreciated it as leaders and pastors as well for people to just come and tell them. And they'd be like, okay, like find wherever works for you. So I was going to do that. And so I sat down and I told myself if I can think of at least 5 things that I don't agree with this church theologically or just in general, then I'm going to do it. And I ended up having to stop at 10.
Oh boy. You're like, once I get into this hole keeps going deeper. I can probably continue.
And I went to the pastor and I requested a meeting and I got it. I was able to pull in my sister for moral support. And I was surrounded by the pastors and they're like, all right, tell us what you want. They thought I was going to tell them, oh, I've sinned and whatever, typical meeting.
Right.
But I just told them straight up, like, I'm here to read this list to you of the reasons why I'm leaving. And they like immediately stopped me and said, nope, you're going to hell. You're leaving the truth. You're twisted. And that for me was really critical. And like, it really shaped the way I then started to view pastors. I had seen them in a different way because my dad protected me from a lot of that, of not seeing certain pastors who were
big egomaniacs.
Yeah. Or narcissist.
Right.
And
control freaks, narcissistic.
Yeah. And so that was something that my dad protected my siblings and I a lot from, because he knew that would really affect our views of Christianity and our faith. So when I saw that up front and for it to be directed at me, that's when I was like, I don't ever want to be a part of a church like this. I'm going to be very strategic about how I look for a church. So I went back to college. That was my junior year. So I finished that all up. I officially left. And I told my leader, I had already gotten into grad school in Boston. So I asked her, can you pray with me? I really want to find a church in Boston that is culturally diverse, because I had grown up in a Latinx church and I wanted to see different kinds of people in the church that I was going to attend, and a place where everyone is welcome. Those are my two requirements. I just want to see everyone be able to have a seat at the table. Lafayette was huge of, there's always room for more, like we're a family, we all sit together and have dinner, like a Latinx family. Regardless of how our stance or theology is, like we can talk about it. And we're going to find commonality, and let's think about the commonalities rather than what divides us. And so I wanted that in a place where I could go to church. Like there could obviously be differences and we can talk about it and debate it. But at the end of the day, we can get up and say, hey, let's go grab a drink. And that was a place that I wanted to have as a church. So I told my mentor that, like, a place that's diverse, ethnically and racially diverse, and a place that is welcoming of all people. And we prayed, and a year later came to Boston. And yeah, that's kind of where it all began here in Boston.
So you got to Boston. It was in what year was that?
2017.
2017. Okay.
Yes.
So that was the year that I left Hillsong, which I guess would make sense because I had been interacting quite a bit with Josh Kimes while he was here. For those
who don't know, Josh Kimes was in NYC and then later became the pastor of Hillsong Boston. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And around the time that I left, it was probably just before I left, was when Josh and Leona moved to Boston. So, okay. So that gives me a little bit of an idea of like the time frame and whatnot. So 2017, rolls around, you find at that point, my Hillsong timeline kind of fades, around there. So had Hillsong Boston fully launched?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So I get to Boston. I had attended Hillsong Phoenix twice in the summer. So I graduate in May. I go down to live in Phoenix with my sisters. And a friend invites me because I was no longer going to their church, my family's church. So then my friend invites me like, oh, I'm going to Hillsong with my sister. Do you want to come? So we all go visit in Hillsong Phoenix. And that's where I kind of started hearing about things that were happening within. And I fill out a prayer card, or like a welcome card, because they were giving out a free cup to whoever filled out a card. And I was like, oh, I want a cup too. So I filled one out and I put my info and I said, I'm moving to Boston. Could you pray that I could find a church there? And I just left it. A few weeks later, I get a message saying there's Hillsong Boston that's starting. Maybe we can get you connected with people there. And that's all I heard. I knew something was happening in Boston because of that card, because they had probably heard it at Heart for the House or whatever they call it. And I'm glad I'm forgetting the lingo. So that's how I had heard about Boston happening. So when I get here, one day I was laying on my bed. I was like, oh, I should look for more churches. Like, what's around my area? I had already kind of moved in, and this was fast forward in September 2017.
Okay.
I see that Hillsong, or the Boston location, had their first worship service. So that it wasn't even an official Wednesday night or Sunday, nothing. It was just a worship service they had. And it had happened the day before. And I was like, oh crap, I missed it. So I see that the worship night had happened, and I was like, okay, let me fill out like some more information. So I fill out like a my Hillsong, whatever. And that's like a profile you can fill out in their website to get you connected, to get to like connect groups. So I signed up for, or I asked for more information on the block, which is like an East Coast thing. I've learned that over the years that other campuses don't use the word the block.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I thought that was just the general Hillsong lingo.
I've heard people in Australia, when I've like told them about the block, they're like, what is that? So I don't know if it's just like a US thing or like an actual East Coast thing, but that's what it was. So like youth and young adults, kind of more young adults than anything, but yeah, so I feel like
isn't Hillsong young adults, period? Like that is sort of a Hillsong.
The majority of the people there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I immediately get, not immediately, within like a few hours, I get a message from someone, one of the leaders, and they're like, oh, we're having a midweek, like kind of Bible study just to get to know people. Would you like to come? They give me the location. And I was like, oh, sure. Like I'm still getting to know different churches in the area, and I wanted to see if this was a good spot. So I go, and it was probably like a Monday or Tuesday, and we're like, I get there, and one of the leaders is Indian, and then I don't want to say names because they were volunteers, and I'll say the names of people who are being paid.
Yeah.
So this person was Indian, and then there's two other people who are white. And I was like, okay, well, some diversity. That's fine. And the rest of the people in the crowd are like in the circle, because there was a few of us sitting around a table. They were like Asian and Latinx. And I was like, oh, like there's a good mix of like young people here. Like this is fun. So like that was kind of fulfilling one of my criteria of like diverse. I was like, all right. So we start talking, and we have like a little like meet and greet kind of thing. And at the end of it, they say, the Indian guy like stands up. He's like, all right, well, thank you everyone for coming. We just want to let you know that this coming Wednesday is going to be our first volunteer night. So if you want to be a part of Hillsong Boston and help us volunteer, by volunteering, come to this, you'll be trained, and like you can get more involved. And I was like, dude, you don't even know if I'm a Christian. Yeah, like you're just standing up and already asking me to volunteer.
So it's funny that you say that, because when I got to Hillsong, I actually was coming from, I had been on the ministerial staff of another church that was pretty much, I guess the best way to describe it, or the easiest way to describe it, is a kind of a knockoff of Mark Driscoll's original style of like the Mars Hill hyper Calvinist post grunge, but like they drew lines in the sand about your doctrine. So like you had these church covenants you had to sign, you had to testify that you had accepted Christ and that you adhered to, like, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but like practically adhering to all the 5 points of Calvinism's soteriology, right? So that was the environment I came from, and I was pushing against that hard. So when I got to Hillsong, the fact that they were like, you can volunteer, and they weren't doing any sort of checks, like there's no doctrinal statement that I have to adhere to. That's cool. Like you can just sort of, I say I'm a Christian, cool.
And probably a piece of that in your story, Nate, which you didn't mention, but I think it's relevant, is that, part of your being pushed out, although they didn't say it explicitly, had to do with you pushing back against doctrine, had to do with, the being asked to resign, having, they didn't explicitly say it, but you started asking the wrong questions and started hanging with the wrong leaders that were leaving, who were asking the questions they didn't like. So, I mean, I think, that whole feeling of being forced to believe certain things in order to be in service, and, that was your job. So it was probably quite traumatic to go out on those kind of terms. And then you're at Hillsong, and then it's like, yeah, you don't have to sign anything. You don't have to agree with any specific thing to be part of it. It's very different.
Yeah, so I guess for me, it's sort of the opposite of your experience, at least as I'm hearing it, right? Because you're looking a little bit side eye at the fact that they're not even asking you if you're a Christian.
It's kind of quick though.
Yeah.
It's kind of quick. First meeting,
Yeah.
you, hey, want to volunteer?
And I think the reason why I viewed it like, why aren't they checking if I'm even a Christian, was because of the way I had grown up, of like,
right,
the people who are volunteering in church are people who are constantly attending. And they've like have this record of being like good attendees. And so then if they ask to volunteer, or the pastor goes to them and be like, you're pretty consistent. Can you help us in this area?
it's like they're vetting you properly. You know, they care that their volunteers actually are somewhat vetted.
That's how Hillsong gets you to become a consistent attendee.
Oh, yeah.
They get you to volunteer.
And they
put
tell
you on a
you like to
schedule.
become part of the family, like come and go to growth track.
So you got involved at Hillsong. What were you doing? What team were you on?
Yeah, so I started off as a host. When I first walked in, I noticed that a lot of the people who were welcoming, and this was just a volunteer night, not even the first Wednesday, they were all white, like all white women. And so that for me was like, how are you? Like, I want a diverse church. Like, that was my first category. So I was like, how can I make this happen? And so I joined the host team, and I was the only brown person there. And at first it was really awkward because we would have like our little team huddles and like, okay, who has a prayer request? And I'd be like, yeah, my mom is going through the immigration process. Can you like pray for her? And they were like, oh, like, what is that? So it's like,
Wow.
or some of them
request
were
number
like,
2, can Hillsong become more diverse? Oops, I'm not supposed to say that here.
so I was like, oh crap, like I need to stay here in order for more people to come in that look like me. That was my first thought of like, how can I be part of this, like welcoming in? So I became part of the host team, and I was at the door, like they put me in the front. So as people were coming in, they would see a brown person, they would like come towards me, and I would like sit them down. If they only spoke Spanish, like I would talk to them in Spanish. So for me, that was like really cool because I was like, oh, I'm like the one that they see.
You
it
saw
looks like
like the way you made people just feel welcome in that space and how it made a big difference to them.
Yeah, and I quickly rose to like helping out in leadership there. So I was in charge of certain areas of the host team. And then I was starting to get really exhausted because I'm not an extrovert, and Hillsong is very extroverted, and you thrive there if you're an extrovert. And that was like not my thing.
Did Boston have the big church vibe the way Manhattan does? Like, did it feel more of a small church vibe, or did it feel like
it started off on Wednesday nights? So we started off in and I say we because I was part of it. It was a Baptist church. It's called Ruggles Baptist Church. It's a smaller church, and I thought it looked cool because like I was used to a smaller church like that. You could probably fit 250. I think that was the count we got. Could sit in like there were actual pews, like wooden pews. And the lighting looked really cool for me because I had never seen lighting in a church like that. So the architecture mixed with like the modern lighting.
It's a beautiful combination.
Yeah, it made it really nice. So for me, I was like, oh, maybe this is what we're going to be doing on Sundays. Like, I can do this. So that's where it started. And then we went to Royale, which is a nightclub here in Boston. Weirdly enough, they are under Royale downstairs. There's another club that is a gay club. I don't know why they would rent out a place that was a gay club, and I don't know why the club would allow them to be in there.
What's funny, so there's for like team nights and stuff in Manhattan, I forgot what church they would hold them at. There was this church downtown, and it was a mainline. It was an old mainline church. They were pretty progressive, and they had little pride flags all around their property. And well, they used to have like a handful, like 2 or 3 like larger size pride flags. But when Hillsong would show up, they would take them down. They, stash them in a closet or something. I didn't mean to make a pun there, but so then
right, yeah, we're going back in that closet.
Yeah. So and it became kind of a point of contention between this church. I think they're an Episcopal church. I could be wrong, but it was an old mainline church. It was a little point of tension between them and Hillsong, and they stopped letting Hillsong use their facility for team night.
Good.
So I think at one point the church was getting fed up with Hillsong like stashing the pride flags in a closet, that they instead of decorating with like 3 or 4 large pride flags, they would put like hundreds of tiny little pride flags all over the property. So then even if Hillsong wanted to come back, they wouldn't, because that would be a pain in the ass to have to take all of that down. So either you leave all of this stuff up or you just don't come.
Wow.
Well,
there was a church that they tried to rent out for midweek instead of Royale. I heard about this later because I joined the events team after I left host.
Oh, okay.
And the church had a lot of pride flags. So then the events team went to the venue or the church leaders and like, can we take some of these things down? And they said, no, why would you take that down? Like, this is our decorations. You work around it.
Yeah.
And so then Hillsong was like, okay, then we can't rent it out.
Yeah.
That's kind of where my wheels started turning, but yeah.
They did the same. So the church that Gail and I attend now.
Can I tell the story? Oh, you were actually more involved, so go ahead.
So when I started attending there, I got to know the pastor pretty well, and when she found out that I had come from Hillsong, she pulled me into her office once and just kind of was asking me some questions, because apparently she had to have some dealings with Hillsong. The Hillsong Montclair was meeting right across the street from our church. And our church has like the biggest pride flag in Montclair is just like draped across the building. So John Termini called our pastor and asked about renting the space because they wanted to start doing an evening service, but they couldn't afford to use the Wellmont for their evening service, and it wasn't likely that they would have the numbers that they have in the morning. So they wanted to start off in a smaller venue. And our church isn't a small venue. I think total seating capacity is probably like close to 1,000, but it's designed in that sort of old cathedral way where.
So if you're a small group, it feels cozy.
Yeah.
You can all sit around the front. And you don't have to use the balconies and whatnot.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he calls and asks about renting, but he was asking for the pastor. I don't remember the story very clearly, so I could be fucking it up, but I'll tell it as I remember it, and then if Reverend Dan is listening to this, I'm sorry, I'm screwing up the story. But if I remember correctly, he had called and wanted to talk to the pastor. Didn't realize that our pastor was a woman, and kind of got salty with her, and. She basically said, look, first of all, I know who you are. I have people in my congregation who escaped your church and were severely traumatized by you. And what would it say to my congregation if one of them drove by one night and saw the big Hillsong logo on the side of our building? How could I face my people if I did something like that? Additionally, I know you're going to want to take our pride flag down, and that is something that we never take down. So you'll have to work around it, but also it's not happening.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I was very grateful when she told me that story.
That's awesome. We need more pastors like that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you went from host team to events, and events is sort of a big step up. So for those listening who aren't aware of like the lingo,
I'm like, what team are you on?
Yeah.
I feel like that's a Hillsong question. The rest of us are like, what's that all about?
Yeah, because it also helps to categorize there were some lines drawn in the sand between some of the teams,
because that's
right?
what tells you what access you had.
Yeah.
So the
Exactly.
important point to take away in terms of this part of our conversation is that Hillsong is a little bit of a lot of a ladder climbing church, and there are many different levels to it, and working your way up into the important levels is a part of the whole system.
And you work up by volunteering in different areas. Yeah.
Yep. So it's funny you say events. I have so many memories of dealing with the events team because as a service producer,
I love the word.
Yeah. They weren't good. This was not healthy interaction. I wouldn't call this like church interaction at all. It was, and it wasn't even good business interaction.
Nope.
It was hostile.
Mm-hmm.
And because the thing is, we all wanted to ladder climb. And
just to clarify, you were part of creative, right?
I was part of creative.
Okay. We thought the same thing about creative.
Yep. See, and it happened in Boston the same way it happened in New York.
Wow.
So for people who think it's one place, it's interesting when these systems replicate themselves in every Hillsong church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it replicates because the leader, the events leader came from New Jersey.
Oh.
So they brought the system over here.
I see.
And I won't say their name because they're a volunteer.
Because they were a volunteer. But I think I know who you're talking about. After we hit stop, I'm going to ask you to confirm.
Yeah, I know a lot of the events people from New Jersey because of that. The people who started the events team in Connecticut.
Right.
In Manhattan. And I had to go to New York to train.
The Chapel Probation podcast takes a critical look at evangelical colleges and universities, focusing initially on Azusa Pacific University, where I taught English for 15 years. I'm Scott Okamoto, and I'm writing a book about how I deconstructed from faith completely while at APU. This podcast, though, is my tribute to the students and other faculty who survived evangelical higher education. They faced ridiculous racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ hatred, and all manner of bigotry. From the heartless evils of the prosperity gospel to the destructive pseudo-theology of purity culture, the stories will break your heart, but they will also inspire. These people faced bigotry and fought back. In a weird, kind of sick way, we went through some shit, but we formed identities and we formed communities through it all. I hope you will join us.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this episode. I want to take a quick break from the conversation to let you know that we have a fantastic new way for you to support the podcast. If you like what you hear from our show and want to partner with us, head over to patreon.com/fullmutuality to donate. As a partner, you'll get exclusive content, access to occasional live recording events, and more for as little as $5 a month. Thank you already for your support of what we're creating, and now, back to the conversation. So I want to transition to probably a little bit more of a maybe challenging conversation, some questions that I had, because knowing that you had joined in 2017, I guess the first question is, were you aware of, or maybe actually let me back up a little bit more. At what point did you get a better sense of your own gender identity or sexual orientation? Was that before or after?
That was after
Hillsong?
I had joined Hillsong.
After Hillsong. Okay. So that changes how I frame my question. So then at that point, was that like, did that become kind of a clear delineation, like this place isn't safe for me, or were you not aware of perhaps some of the drama that had taken place in New York? How did all of that play out for you?
That's a good question. Yeah, I wasn't aware because I didn't Google, and you have to really look and use specific words in order to find it. Hillsong is really good about hiding certain things.
Yeah.
They have the money to do it. So when I started, I had joined in 2017, at the end of 2017, so like October. By February 2018, we started Sunday services at Royale. So I was doing events lead. I was super busy all the time, running around on Sundays. And then because I had left home and I was far away, I had the space and the safety to start questioning again. And I say again because I always knew that there was something different about me in comparison to my siblings. I knew from the age of like 4, like I had a crush on my preschool teacher. Teacher Kelly, she was really cute and I loved her and I always wanted to be with her. I didn't know English very well and I learned English in order to talk to her. When I was around 6, my brother got married. He's like 13 years older than me and he's the only brother I have. So then when my sister-in-law came to live with us for a bit, my mom was like, oh, you're the best daughter-in-law I've ever had. And she kind of laughs, responding, oh, I'm the only one you'll ever have. And so they're like laughing within them. And I'm over here, a 6-year-old sitting like, wait, why is she the only one? Like, why can't I marry a girl?
Wow. So that's a question you were asking yourself really young, even before you recognized your own
Yeah.
identity.
And when we would play Barbies, it was like, why do I have to have Ken? Why does Ken only have to be a boyfriend?
Can we get rid of Ken?
Yeah, I'm like, he's not very cute. You can't really do his hair. So I would just be like, oh, either the single Barbie or like a best friend would live with her. Because I learned really quickly at home, like, you can't, like, homosexuality or LGBTQ people are sinning, and that's not right.
Was there a piece of you that developed a shame, as in something might fit with that category, or like in your head that question didn't surface yet?
There was some shame, but at the same time, I think I pushed it down so much. My dad was diagnosed with lupus when I was around 7, so that took a huge part of what I was thinking and the things that I was doing. So I was in and out of the hospital.
You weren't asking.
So I didn't have time to ask it because at the time there wasn't a lot of research for lupus. So doctors are like, didn't know how to treat my dad. They were saying one day, oh, he's going to die tonight. Say goodbye. And then the next day we'd come in, he's still alive. We're like, oh, great. I still have a dad. So that was like a huge part. And there's a lot of trauma that came from that. So I didn't have the time to be thinking about myself. Everything had to be about my family. And if my dad were to not be around, like, how do we support my mom? As siblings, like, we were asking each other that, like, what do we do about church? Like, what do we do about, like, different little things that are our house or school? So I had to grow up really fast at home because of that, which is what ended up taking him when I was 16. He ended up passing away due to lupus complications that made his kidneys fail. And that's a whole nother thing you can Google. It's like super complicated. We don't have to get into that. So I didn't have time growing up to think about it. So now that I was in a space where I was away from home, and I say away from home because I didn't have a safe space to do it at home. One of my sisters had questioned and that did not go well. And so that put me further in the closet. So I was like,
questioned in terms of her sexuality?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So she had questions her sexuality. I saw how my mom had reacted, which was not pretty. And so then that put me further in the closet. So when I was finally really far away across the country, or she was at least in Mexico on the Pacific side, and I was in Boston, now I was like, I can do this. Like, I'm far away. And I couldn't even do it in Arizona because I was so close. Like, I felt I was still too close. So I was in Boston and I start asking these questions of like, wait, something's different. And I've always known this, but I've never allowed myself to go there. So then I take a class in graduate school. I was getting my master's in public health. I took a class in gender and sexuality within healthcare, which is a really cool class. And our first class, we had to give our identity. And this was like a memory I remembered recently. I was like, oh, wow. We had to go around the class, share who you are, share what makes you you. So like all of your identities. And so everyone was sharing like, oh, I'm queer, I'm non-binary. I was like, what are these words I've never heard? So it comes to me and I'm like, I'm straight. I don't know what else. And they're like cisgender. I was like, I don't know what that means, but okay. And it kind of goes to the next person. And I'm like, those don't feel right. There's something not there's something different. So as the class kept going, I began to question more, and it was a safe space because there was a lot of queer people in the class. So then I could ask questions to them, like, tell me about you. Like, what does love look like for you? What does daily life look like for you? Because whenever I would think about queer couples or LGBTQ couples, Christian evangelicalism tends to only think about sex. And it's really frustrating because there's more to a person than sex. And that was what was really frustrating for me growing up, that I didn't really care for it because I was little. And now that I had the space to do it, and I was realizing, and I was seeing how they were flourishing, and they were in relationships that were really healthy and living their best lives, that was something I wanted for myself. So I had this space in school where I could start questioning, but I was also attending Hillsong. And so then it gets to the point where I'm like, okay, I think I'm queer. At the time I was saying bi because I wanted to give my mom some sense of hope that I could marry a man. I knew internally that was never going to happen. So I was like, I think this is my identity. I wasn't even questioning my gender identity at the time. So then I was like, what does that look like within Hillsong, within the church that I'm attending? So then that's where my questions started to like arise of my faith. And I started to try to look within the website for Hillsong, and I couldn't find anything. And at the time we were going through Growth Track had started. Okay. So if you don't know what Growth Track is, it's when you want to volunteer, you go through 4 sessions, and I forget what the B's, it's the 4 B's, believe, belong, become, and build. I think those are the 4. Okay. Memory unlocked. But anyway, so you had to go through Growth Track, and at the end of it, you had to sign a code of conduct. And the code of conduct wasn't implemented until probably like 6 months after I had started. So I was part of the events team. We were putting on Growth Track, and we supposedly had to sit and watch them. I didn't have time to do that. So I was like, yep, I did it, whatever. And they would just like check mark it because they knew. So I read the code of conduct because I was like, okay, there has to be something within here that tells me. And when I was reading through it, the only scriptures that were coming up were about purity culture. So it was like about not having sex. And it didn't say anything about sex between who. Right. And so for me, that was like, oh, okay. Like I need to ask this question a little bit more. But your code of conduct isn't telling me I can't be queer. And you're only talking about sex, and I'm not going to have sex. So, right. Yeah, like I can sign this. So I signed it. And I was like, yeah, I can uphold it. And that's when I go to my leader, and I called them, my events leader. And I asked her one day, I sent her an article first, because I was starting to like Google, can you be queer and Christian? And a lot of things were coming up from like, no, it's a sin, to, yes, it's okay. Like we're affirming, and I learned the words like affirming, or the fact that, words like, malakoi and arsenokoitai, and like Greek words that were in the Bible in the original text, had been mistranslated in 1946. So all these things were starting to come up. And so I was really, really questioning, and I didn't know what was true. Or I didn't know what was, what was true for myself. And so I sent this article of a guy who was questioning his sexuality, and he was a Christian, and he is able to like bring it together. And so I sent it to my leader. I was like, what do you think about this? Like someone sent this to me, and I really want to get your thoughts. And she's like, can we have a phone conversation? And I was like, okay, sure. She's like, I don't like to have these types of conversations over text. I'm like, okay, fair.
I mean, I could see why someone might not want that, but I guess maybe the
now I know they didn't want it. They didn't want it on record.
Didn't want it right. Yeah.
So then she calls me and she's like, oh, I read it and I have my thoughts, but I want to know yours first.
Ooh.
And I was like, okay, well, I thought it was interesting. Like, I'm still like, I don't know. I grew up having queer friends and my parents said it was okay. Like, typical love the sinner, hate the sin.
Right.
And I was like, but I'm really trying to understand, like, what that looks like now for my faith, because it's been shifting so much from where I came from. And so I was like, I want to know what the church's stance is. And she's like, well, you know, it really depends on the person. And that's a case by case, like, conversation.
Wow. How does a church have a case by case?
That is what Carl Lentz said.
Yeah.
So when the Josh Canfield stuff came up, there was a whole firestorm, and this was back in, I think, 2014 or 2015. When it became known that, I mean, he was already out, and that was the thing about Josh, is that everybody in Hillsong, New York, well, not everybody, but everyone who interacted with him at Hillsong, New York, knew that he was gay, or is gay, and that I believe he was engaged while serving. So it wasn't like his sexual orientation and relationship were a secret. As far as I can recall, I had just started attending when all of this went down, so I didn't know Josh or anything. But then when all of this started swirling around, because he was on TV, he was on Survivor, and then he was giving interviews about being queer and Christian and serving at a church. And so when all of this started swirling around, I think he made a mention that he was a team lead, and so Brian Houston had to make a statement because it was big news. He was on national television in the U.S. Possibly, I mean, Survivor might have even been a show that was exported. So this was like news that Brian Houston felt he needed to address. So he came down with the whole, like, well, we want everyone to feel loved at Hillsong, but we affirm the biblical, form of or biblical mandates for marriage or something like that, which says nothing, because what does the Bible say about marriage?
I mean,
anyway?
But it's a good dog whistle for people who believe that the Bible says it's to be one man and one woman. If they already have that perception of that's what the Bible says, then he doesn't need to elaborate on what the Bible says or get into it. Right. You just know they'll assume that's that's what you're getting.
So in response to that, the congregation in New York City felt frustrated by that response. So Carl then followed up with when it comes to this, we want to have a conversation. We want to love everybody, and we don't, like, cause somebody, I don't remember what, I think it was on Huffington Post. He was being interviewed, and I remember the video, and he was sitting there, and they were asking him, so what about queer people, and he was like, well, we want to love everyone, and it's easy to make a statement. It's easy because everybody wants to hear, like, your little statement that they can make a soundbite and put it out there. But this is such an important thing, and we want to love people well, that it needs to be a conversation, and so that, like, your description of a case by case thing, that was the Hillsong, the standard Hillsong answer, especially here. Hillsong East Coast, Hillsong, big city Hillsong for sure.
So how did that hit you, hearing your leader, that or I'm not sure if she was your leader. I'm not remembering which position she had in your life, if she was a mentor or what, but she said that to you in the conversation. How did that feel? Like, were you satisfied with that answer, or was it really bothering you that it wasn't more concrete?
Yeah, I needed more, and I kept asking more. I grew up in a family that had these types of conversations.
That had very plain, direct sort of communication, didn't skirt around saying what they thought.
And so I brought it up and I was like, okay, but that doesn't tell me anything of like what the church's belief is. Like, I want to be respectful of the church I'm in. And if this isn't a place for me, then I can walk away. But at the time I told her, I have a friend who's gay and they want to be a volunteer. So what does that mean for them? Like you saying it's a case by case basis. And she was like, well, we would have to sit down and talk with them and see where they're at. And then see what kind of like positions they could be in. And I was like, so there's areas you can't be in. And she's like, well, like I said, it's a case by case basis. So we'd have to talk to them. And I was like, you're not giving me anything.
You're not actually answering any of these questions.
No. And so then I was like, okay, fine. Like, I'm the friend. It's me. Like, I'm the queer person. And so then she stays quiet on the phone. And she's like, okay, why do you feel the need to tell me this? And I was like, well, I was like, because it's a big part of who I am. And I'm starting to open up about this part of my life. And I really want to share it with you. And like I said, I want to be respectful of whatever church I'm at. Like the things I cannot do, like I won't do. Like, that's okay for now. And so she kind of just was like, okay, well, we can definitely continue to have this conversation. She's like, but what I can tell you is that what you're doing right now is okay. Like any leadership levels you have are fine. So at the time I was a service lead for the events team, which meant I was in charge of ensuring that all events teams were doing what they were supposed to be doing, checking in on them to make sure they weren't having anxiety attacks. And if they were, take them to the side, calm them down, and bring them back in.
Quick pause. Sorry. The fact that a team at a church is likely to have anxiety attacks just might say something about the church culture. But
yeah.
Okay, so your role, you would take your team aside and check in to make sure they weren't having anxiety attacks.
So I would check in on them. Like there was team members who
when you checked in where you're like, we'll continue this. We're going to continue to be in a conversation about how you're doing. No, I'm just kidding.
No,
what does checking in look like? No,
I was more genuine, and I would be like,
I know you were taking care of your people.
It sounds like you need to step back. Like, let's go over here. Let's let it out over here.
But I mean, like, I guess my joke was just meant more in the line of like, no wonder people are having anxiety attacks if you don't know where you stand. Like, I don't know how you weren't having an anxiety attack, Noemi. So, okay, all right.
I was.
So you're like, I understand why you're having an anxiety attack.
I was. And there was people who there was this person who was volunteering. Their dad had passed away the day before and they were volunteering. And I know what that was like. So I saw her. She was numb, obviously, to the pain.
Yeah.
And I saw her listening to a worship song and she starts bawling. And I saw her from afar. And I started noticing that it's starting to get there. And I quickly grabbed some tissues and a water and I sit her down. I'm like, let's sit down. Like, you need a moment. And I was like, just listen in. Honestly, like, I know what it's like. You're still processing the pain. So I kind of just like, you do you. Don't worry about anything you have to take care of. Like, we'll figure out someone else.
Wow.
But
I could go to church when my dad passed for a while just because I was so raw that, like, if anyone said the wrong thing to me, I was afraid that my filter was gone and I might bite someone's head off by accident. It was like, if someone's like, your dad's in a better place, that's going to send me over the edge at that moment. Like, it was a horrible comment to say to me. Not that I didn't believe that at the time.
No, and as someone who had grown up as like a pastor's kid or like a poster child for a church, I had to be there the day after he died. And I had to sit in and people would come up to me and I had to keep a straight face and say, thank you.
Oh, I can't even, ooh.
Like, I knew I had to put the mask on. So when I got to Hillsong, I had taken the mask off while I was in InterVarsity. And while I was at Hillsong, I put it on again without realizing it. And I would take it off only when I was in the events room. So I was also in charge of ensuring that all the sheets were done correctly. So when I say sheets, it's a time sheet. So which basically says minute by minute, what's going to happen in the service, who's going to say what songs are going to be sung. So I would edit those, ensure that it got to the correct person. or to the correct people, because there's only certain people
there
could
were-
receive one.
There were a bunch, and I was one of those people that was always asking for more because I had enough people on my team who needed it, and inevitably, and so it got to the point where our events team was like, okay, I'm not giving them to Nate anymore. I'm just going to go around to all the people that Nate wants me to send them to, and I'll hand them off.
So I was the person who would, at first, when we didn't have a lot of people, I would be the one to edit it, print it, cut them out, run them, and like take them to the people who had to get them. And I got to know these people. And if I would get there right before it started, I was like, so sorry, I'm here. Like, how many do you need? And then at first I would like hand them out like candy. And I was quickly pulled aside, like, nope, you can't do that. Like, you can only give it to these list of people. No one is supposed to be knowing minute by minute what's happening. And I'm like, what's so special about this list?
What secrets are in this list? It honestly, it speaks to, I think, the larger culture at Hillsong, and it's no surprise that they were so tight-fisted about something as minuscule as a timesheet. That there would have been no, if that got out, there would have been no issue. But they were keeping secrets. They were keeping bigger secrets. And so they just had to lock everything down. They just had to get into the practice of everything needed to be as locked down as possible.
Yeah.
Because if the wrong thing leaked, the church overall could
high
be fucked,
control
which
environment
we're seeing right now.
Yeah. So that was a big part of like, and I would edit other things of like, one of them was a sheet of like the script of what the, not the offering person would say, because that was vetted by Josh. But like any announcements that were going to be given, who, like, if there was a dedication, the names of the children, and then they would put them in binary colors, so like black, blue, and pink, which was really bothersome to me when I was there. I was like, ew. Now I know why it was bothersome, but at the time I didn't. So I would do all of that and run them. So I got to know a lot of people because of that, because I had the pass. I could get to the backstage, give them to the people who needed it back there. To different areas, and people started to like get to know me, and I would talk to them, and I had grown up in church, so I knew how to treat people as a pastor's kid, who had to maintain this like culture and label, so people would quickly like open up with me and like be happy, or they'd say, oh, you have a great smile. I'm like, no, I just know how to put it on. Like I was taught from an early age. But thank you, I do. And those are the kinds of things that were like, I was in charge of. So service lead. And then I had started together with 3 other people, a Spanish speaking connect group.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to find a way to recreate kind of the Latinx thing that I had in undergrad. And one of the ways I was like, oh, I can bring Spanish like speaking people together, because I can't say Latinos. Because then they'd be like, oh, you're excluding, or you're being exclusive. So I was like, okay, like Spanish speaking. So I started that connect group, and I was one of the leaders. And by that point, 2 of the leaders had left. So it was only 2 of us left that we were leading it. So I was like, okay, you have me leading a connect group, and you have me as an event service lead. And those 2 things are okay for me as a queer person. And she's like, yep, that's fine. Like, I don't see a problem with it right now. And I was like, okay, right now. So in the future, maybe. And she's like, well, whoever, like, I'm over you within events. And Steve DeGrossa, who was a staff at the time in Boston.
So I didn't realize he went to Boston. Okay.
Yeah, no qualifications for this man.
No. Definitely not somebody who's
None.
qualified
He
for any
came
of this
from
stuff.
the driver's team. He was driving Joel Houston in New York. Promoted to be a pastor in Boston to help Josh out. He was in charge of connect groups, and she was like, Steve will be okay with it. Like, you're cool with Steve. I was like, yeah, he's okay. I didn't know the guy very well, but we would hang out once in a while. So she was like, okay, so you're fine. So I was like, okay, but if it were to change to a different leadership, do I have to ask them and like continue to be asking and coming out constantly to the new leader? And she's like I said, it's a case by case basis. So
Oh my God.
we can have conversations. And I was like, oh crap. So I was like, okay, fine. Like, let's just take it for now. I'm okay right now. I don't even know where I'm at internally. So I was like, okay, thank you. I'll see you on Sunday. That Saturday rolled up. I was like, I do not want to go. And that's kind of where it started of me feeling my body quickly picking up on, this isn't a safe space. I don't know why you keep going back. But there's another part of me that was like, this is the only people I know in Boston. I have to go back. Because if I get out, I'm going to lose like this quote unquote family that I had created. So I keep going. And every Saturday I would text my leader and I was like, I don't know if I'm going to go tomorrow. I'm not feeling really well. And she would text me something around the lines of like, when we don't want to go to church, that's when we need to go to church.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh.
Pray hardest when it's hardest to pray.
Yeah.
Oh.
The typical lingo of like manipulation to get you back in the door.
God.
Wow.
So I would show up again at like 7 a.m. and I started to want to know more. And because I wasn't listening into services, I wasn't sitting in on any service because there were barely any volunteers. So I had to be a service lead for all services, which were 2 and then 3 later, towards the end of my time there. But I started listening to podcasts or reading articles. I found this book, this podcast called Queer Theology.
Ooh, yes. We've listened to that.
Yeah.
It's
And
awesome.
I really wanted to understand more. And I was like, oh, who's this? And then I found Queerology. And then I found Kevin Garcia. And then I started finding all of these lists of people. So my mornings then before, as I was getting ready for church and on my way to church, I was listening to all these things and I was like, so happy, like, yeah. And I would do that
built
because
up in who you are and exploring all kinds of stuff you've never heard before, never thought of with relation to who you are and what your faith means to you.
Yeah. And it started really shifting and I started to like learn more and be okay with everything. I read then a book with one of my friends that was published by InterVarsity. I don't recall what the book is, but I tell my friend like, "Hey, I'm having this hard time right now with my sexuality and my faith. Like, can we talk?" And my friend and I, we were really close. We had both been in InterVarsity, and she's like, "Oh my God, I think there's a book about this from InterVarsity. Let's read it together." So we read it.
I ask a few questions about this book because I have a vivid InterVarsity memory that's popped back in my head from Urbana. Was it possibly a guy who was straight and all his friends came out to him at the same time and he started no? Okay.
No, it's another guy.
I'll add a quick, and the reason I want to tell this story tied to InterVarsity because I think it's important. When I went, they had an InterVarsity session on homosexuality and it was so packed. That room was so packed that people were filling up the tables underneath the table. Like it was a fire hazard. That room was an entire fire hazard because they could not fit in all the people that were in the evangelical church going, can we please hear some conversation on this? And the guy who they brought in, I feel like, I don't know where he's at now, but I feel like he was pushing all of the lines of that whole conversation as far as he could go in evangelicalism without being like, I'm affirming. Like he was like talking about how when people came to Jesus, how he didn't give answers, he asked questions back. And like he was expressing, how the queer community perceives Christians and how we've done damage. And like he's just saying all this stuff without directly saying, oh, and I'm affirming. Like he was pushing that. And then I felt like the next time I went back to Urbana, they had nothing when it came to queer people. And that was, I mean, the last time I went was probably the first time you went. But what's interesting about that is also they started bringing in all the policy after that where they made InterVarsity leaders take a position.
That's when I was a part of it.
So that came into play after that session at Urbana that I had been to, where it felt like certain people within the movement were trying to push things forward and maybe publishing books that were getting backlash.
Yeah,
and then
so
all
when
of a sudden,
InterVarsity gave their stance, I was a junior or a sophomore in college, and I saw like the effects of that. A lot of people started leaving of like, how could you not be affirming? Like, Or how can you force people to take a stance if InterVarsity is a place where you could ask all these questions of like everyone?
You had to have that exact unaffirming position to be a staff member.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. And I don't know which year that was happening. Do you have an idea what sense of when that was?
Probably like 2015, 2016.
So I feel like a lot of evangelical parachurch organizations
that
call
before.
themselves. Okay.
It was before Urbana 15.
Okay. Right before then. I feel like there was a bunch of different evangelical organizations that claimed to be, parachurch or interdenominational that started to take very hard stances. Like I was a part of BSF, which is Bible Study International, and they did the same thing where they were like, before that, they didn't have a hard stance. And then all of a sudden, all the leaders had to like conform or leave. And then they were telling us in leader meetings, if people leave, it's not necessarily because they're affirming. You can't make that assumption. And it was like, but all the while, like, I just feel like a lot of evangelical organizations around that time period were taking very hard stance all of a sudden with people who'd been volunteering who were queer or who were affirming, that all of a sudden were pushed out of it seemed to become much more of a culture war at a certain point. Where
And I remember
like, wow.
at that time, I was already hinting at wanting to start to question. So when they asked me if I wanted to be on staff or at least intern, because first you have to intern to then be on staff, I was like, I don't think I can do this. Like,
that's at InterVarsity, right?
Yeah. And at InterVarsity, I was like, I'm questioning, like, I'm starting to question. I am like starting to like think about all of these things. Like, I felt like sinful for thinking about them and for starting to have more attractions and crushes towards girls. And I was like, I can't do that. Like, I need to be pure and like purity culture. And like, how can I even have these thoughts? So I was like, no, like I can't. And then I started to like realize like, wait, maybe there's something different. So I kind of had it in a place where I was like, I don't know. But I believe all people should be welcome, and let's have a conversation, to learn more and more me of like, I don't have to take a stance because I'm not a church leader. So when I go to Hillsong and they start telling me the same thing, I'm like, you should have your shit together and tell me what it is. Like InterVarsity did, they took the backlash, but they're going through it. And
they're
they figured
saying
it out.
where they stand on this, and you guys are not.
Yeah.
You're completely sidestepping the whole topic
Yeah,
altogether.
and that was
while we're in leadership and we're serving and we're in your churches and we're doing all these things in leadership, and we don't know when you're going to pull the plug on us and we're going to tell us there's a glass ceiling we didn't know about, or oops, new leader came in, now you're revoked from this privilege.
Yeah. And so that was the place where I was at, was like, wait, I came from a place where like they took the backlash of having a stance that just told people where they were at and allowed those that said this isn't a safe space for me to go and start their own groups and their own Bible studies. Like, why can't you do this as a church? Like, it's telling me that you're purposely wanting to then be ambiguous. And there's something there. So then I start to go to my leader again. And I'm like, I need to continue this. Like you said, we would continue a conversation. So I started pushing for more questions. And this was more so I came out to them early. I came out to a friend first in 2018. We start going through this whole process. I come out to my leader early 2019. No, end of 2018. I come out to my mom early 2019. So like January.
Oh, wow.
So I was like slowly coming out. And as I was like doing it, I was reading books. I was listening to podcasts, reading like whatever I could. And I read this book from InterVarsity. It's this guy who's gay. And so he's trying to reconcile what that looks like for him as a Christian. And within Christianity, a Protestant Christianity, I don't know what this looks like for Catholicism. There are, within the community, they call them side A and side B. So side A is often viewed as the fully affirming, like being LGBTQ is not a sin. God doesn't view you as a sin. You can be in a relationship with someone, a consensual relationship with the person. And that's like fully affirmed by God. Side B is like, you as a person are not a sin, but if you act upon it is a sin. So
they use terms like
behavioral.
same-sex attraction as opposed to homosexual because they want to separate, your how you're attracted versus, you know, what you're doing. So like you can have a same sex attraction, just, you know, just as long as your behavior lines up.
Just
with, you know,
don't talk about
Be
it.
celibate.
And hide it.
Yeah.
It started to become this thing of like, I'm reading all these books, and I remember, and I felt okay about it because when Hillsong started at the beginning of Hillsong Boston, Josh had told us, like, I don't have the time to be pastoring you all because he's going to be busy building this church and y'all are helping me. Typical. So you need to pastor yourself because maybe you won't have time at the beginning to sit down and listen in. And like Sundays are for new believers and connect groups are for people who are like wanting to dive deeper. So we're a church of connect groups, not a church with connect groups. And so
I remember hearing that too.
Yeah. And so for me, it was like, oh, great. Okay. I can listen to whatever I want. I can dig deep in whatever area I want because you're telling me to find what I need.
Pastor yourself. Okay.
Yeah.
Done.
And so I took that and ran with it. And I was finding all these pastors who were affirming and all of these like leaders. And I started reading these books, and that book from InterVarsity that I keep going back to, he talks about in the book, as a side B person, he first ends up going through the clobber passages, which are 6 passages in the Bible where it mentions the word homosexual. And he is going through them and like going through the myths of them and saying, hey, this is actually incorrect. And so he starts like demystifying them, like, this is wrong, this is wrong. But at the end of the book, he ends up saying, but you should be celibate.
Interesting.
And I was like, wait, what? Like,
well, that's InterVarsity evangelicalism for you.
Yeah.
I want to kind of start moving towards the exit door, right? The walking away from Hillsong. I've heard so many stories, and I've had so many people messaging me over the last few weeks, and I'm getting emotional just thinking about some of these messages that I've been getting of people that I remember. When I left and looking, because I didn't go very far, right? I ended up like a year and change later. I ended up at a church right across the street from Hillsong, but so I would see them pretty regularly, and I remember my heart breaking for some of them, like, get out of there. Like, that place is dangerous and toxic. I got a message from one of my friends who said he did the whole like, yeah, fuck that place, it's garbage. And I know you tried to warn me. And there was a little bit of validation, but I also got emotional. I felt like it finally people are seeing it for what it is. So some of the exit stories were so different. Like mine was a very quiet exit. You'd
already deconstructed so much at that point.
I didn't even know that I was walking away from that place for the last time. I just was like, I'm tired. I need a break. And then you have someone like Janice who's like, I'm not going to be one of those people. I'm going to send all the text messages. I'm going to try to get Carl to sit down and talk with me. What about you though? I mean, there's such a wide spectrum. So what was that exit starting to look like for you? What were some of the breaking points as you were on your way out?
So it started to happen more.
Were we at the book? Did we finish where the book played
Oh,
out?
right.
No, we didn't finish the book. I started reading more books after that were actually affirming.
Okay.
Plug into Colby Martin's Unclobbered, Kathy Bulldog's Bridging the Walkless Canyon. I don't know what it's called specifically, but those are really good books if you're looking for that. Justin Lee's another good person to look into. But anyway, so I was already had read all these books. I was like, okay, I'm affirming. I feel at peace with this, with my sexual identity. And now what does that look like in the church that keeps telling me it's a case-by-case basis? So I started bringing it up. I came out to my mom in February, and I met with the leader. That's kind of where the exit kind of started. And the day after I came out, my mom did not take it well. She started Bible thumping me, yelling, like, you're going, like, how could you do this? You're going to hell. This is so wrong. Like, we need to be together as a family kind of thing. So I set the boundary, and I was like, I can't. I was starting to go to therapy at this point, and my therapist, we talked about how to do it best. And I set my boundary, and I hung up the phone probably like 10 minutes after I told her. And I text my leader, and I'm like, hey, I just came out to my mom. We were supposed to hang out the next day, and I was like, can we like just do something fun? I'm having a really hard night. Can we just like, I don't know, play video games, or no, like play board games or something? She didn't play video games, bummer. But I call my other friend from grad school. She comes over, we're like crying. And I'm able to like sleep like a few hours. I go to my leader's house the next day, and it's just her and I. I walk in, and she's folding laundry. I vividly remember every part of it. And I sit down on the chair in front of the couch, and she's like, so what happened? I'm like, I told you I didn't want to talk about this, but okay, here you go. I was like, well, I felt like I needed to come out to my mom. I felt like it was time. And I called her, and it kind of just happened like I told her. And she's like, why do you feel the need to come out to people?
Oh my God.
And I was like, well, because it's a big part of who I am. Like, it's part of my identity. And she's like, well, what is identity?
Jesus is your identity. Jesus should be the only
she's
identity.
Like, what is identity is so elusive.
None of us should ever say what our profession is and what we've studied in, as if that's even, it's so funny because no one would ever say like, don't introduce yourself as a doctor. That's not your real identity. It's Jesus. Don't tell us what you've studied for 5 years in school and to do if that's what you do as your, because that's not your identity. How much more is this an identity than that? But for some reason.
So it didn't go well with your mom, and it didn't go well with your leader.
Yeah. And
how did that continue on with her from that moment when she's trying to be like, why do you need to?
Yeah. So then she goes on. I'm like, okay, so identity for me was a big thing because I'm Latinx, and that's a big part of who I am.
Oh yeah.
And especially as someone who had like helped build up La Fe within a university, I'm like, I help people go through their ethnic journey and like their faith journey and how they come together. And I was like, how could you like tell me that? And I was like, wait, do you even identify as a Black woman then? Like, is that something that you hold on to? And she's like, well, I don't identify as Black first. I identify like I'm a child of God. And you should identify in God first. Oh, God. And she's like, it's frustrating me that people identify with all these things. Like, everything is changing. You should identify in Christ. So it was like, my ethnicity isn't changing. My sexuality isn't changing. At least like in the spectrum of where I was at the time. I was like, no, like, you can't tell me, like, these are things that are who I am. And I can't, like, that's not okay. So we went into that debate, push and pull kind of thing that I was comfortable in. She was clearly getting more frustrated as we went. And it was more, she kind of stopped and said, we'll continue this later. So other people came over, we played board games, whatever. And the conversations started to happen again, like it would come up. And it got to the point where it was starting to affect my mental health, and trigger warning to a lot of like mental health issues of suicide ideation and mental illness. As I'm questioning even more and having these conversations and like debating harder, I start to have a hard time with like the community that I thought would be home is now pushing against me. The place that is actually my home is also against me. The people that are kind of my friends aren't physically here because they're all the way in Arizona. The ones from grad school are like, I'm not very close to them. So it's like, I felt very lonely. And my mind started going down a spiral, and I was in therapy, but I wasn't opening up fully to my therapist because I wasn't very comfortable with them yet. despite me specifically finding a therapist who was gay, Latinx, and
Oh, wow.
like okay with talking about church culture and like religion. And I couldn't open up to them about my mental illness or like my mental health and feeling like I had suicide ideation.
It makes sense. Like if your own mom, if your church community, if everything that you have known for your whole life to be secure places is not accepting you, then even if a therapist is all the markers of what should logically make sense, it would make sense that you just mentally are like, I can't do this anymore.
I would allude to it like, oh, like sometimes I think about like what it would look like to die or what like people would, what it would look like afterwards. Or I'm walking on the street and I just want to like go to the street and get a car to go in front of me and run me over. He's like, oh, everyone does that. Like I didn't really specify what was happening, but he didn't catch on to it. And I do go back. I'm like, George, you didn't catch on to it. And now he's like more like aware
You've
of it.
helped him be a better at his job.
But I ended up having big like episodes, and the first person I would call would be my leader, because that's how she made me very dependent on her. And I would call her and be like,
that's like being sick and going to someone who's going to feed you poison.
yeah. And so I would text her and be like, I want to take these meds now, like they're in my hand, what do I do? And that night she came over, she took the meds away, and she's like, we need to pray, or let's watch this sermon, or let's listen to this podcast. And I was like, oh God, this isn't helping. She's like, we need to journal. We need to do these devotionals. And my best friend from grad school was kind of starting to realize something was not okay. She didn't know the extent of how bad it had gotten. So one day I was with her and I started crying. No, I told her the night that I was going to take the meds, or the day after. I was like, she took the pills away from me and I'm really mad because I'm really tired today and I could have been resting and away from it all. And my friend was like, what happened? Like, what's going on? So she started picking up on it. And her aunt was a pastor at the time of an affirming church in the UCC. And she was gay and she was Black. And she reached out to her aunt. She's like, this is happening and I am not qualified. I don't know what to do. And her aunt was like, get her on the phone with me, or let's talk. And I had met her once and she was really nice. So one day my friend comes over, I all of a sudden go down a spiral again. And she tells me, can you talk to my aunt on the phone? Like, I'm like, sure. Yeah. She's really nice. And I'm on the phone with her. And the first thing she tells me, instead of yelling, instead of telling me to calm down, instead of telling me to listen to this scripture or read the sermon or listen to the sermon or read this, whatever, she tells me on the phone, it sounds like you've been having a really hard time. And it sounds like you need more support around you. I'm like, and I start bawling. I'm like, yeah, I don't know what I need, but that sounds right. And she's like, no one around you right now is qualified to support you. So the best option we have right now to help you is for you to go and get a psychiatric evaluation. Is that something you feel okay doing? And I was like, yeah, okay. Like, I'm okay with that. She's like, okay, you need to pack a bag, go with your friend to the hospital. And when you walk into the ER, tell them, I'm here for a psychiatric evaluation. So she told me step by step what to do. And she's like, take your insurance cards, whatever. So I start packing. My friends start helping me pack a bag. I get to the hospital and I say those exact words and they start processing everything. And my leader gets to the hospital. And so she's like, it was already happening. So it's not like she could do anything about it. And my other friend was there who is agnostic, and she was like, doesn't care much about religion. So I end up going through the process. I get admitted into a psychiatric hospital. I'm there for about 4 days. Only my leader and another person from Hillsong go. No one else. I didn't get a text, a call from any pastor. And that was really eye-opening for me. And I think that's where the exit finally started in my head. And that was in July, end of June, early July, like those final days of the month.
Okay.
And so when I leave the hospital, I was really frustrated because as someone who was a pastor's kid and had gone to hospitals, had gone to like wait outside of the jail while my dad was inside talking to the people in there, would go to funerals. Like, you show up, that's where pastors are most needed. And they weren't pastoring. No one showed up. No one sent a card. No one sent anything even afterwards. No one said anything. But that following Sunday that I got out, I was expected to be at church and to be serving the same way I did before. And when I got to church that Sunday, I was not ready to be around people.
You had no ability to put back all those filters and masks you were used to know how to put on. It was like not able to do those things.
Yeah. And I get there and I go to the events room and I'm like, I'm just going to stay in here all day. I delegated what I needed to delegate. And I was like, I can't do this. And that's when I sit down and I'm like, that's fucked up that they couldn't even show up. So then my leader starts catching up on that. She then starts to talk to me less. She made me do a few devotionals after that where I had to take a picture, send it to her so she could verify that I did it and she could read through it to ensure that I wasn't saying anything that was like queer affirming.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because God forbid you consume any content that might be helpful for your mental health.
Exactly. I had to do this form that I still have somewhere. Of like my emergency plan, if it were to happen again, who within the church do I contact?
All the people that showed up, I have such a huge pool of supportive people to pick from. Isn't it wonderful?
I wanted to have phone numbers of my therapist and my psychiatrist because they put me on medication while I was in the hospital. So it was like all these things, like this person who is not qualified to support anybody wanted to have all these numbers.
This is your leader?
Yeah.
Yeah. This church as an organization, their pastors were MIA constantly. They weren't doing the job of pastors. None of them were even qualified to handle any of these things anyway. But even if they weren't around. They weren't doing their jobs. So then they passed those jobs off to connect group leaders, to team leads, people who are not qualified at all. At the very least, they could have, this church is rich. They could have paid for some kind of credentialing for these leaders that they were supposed to be equipping, quote unquote, to go pastor, right? To go take care of their connect groups. But none of them are equipped. And then they pull this stupid shit because they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So like somebody like this who's not qualified is trying to be your care manager.
Yeah, basically.
Getting your psychiatrist's phone number, your therapist's phone number, and do what with it?
And I had a care manager at the hospital, and it was a very different experience. Like they wanted to understand and they would get the numbers for me, or they would make the appointments for me to go after I got out. And they would explain to me everything they were doing, why they were asking certain questions, for what they needed the information for.
Transparency.
Yes, exactly. And with my leader, that was not the case. There was nights where she would request an Uber for me to get in the car and go and sleep at her place because she was worried. I was like, I needed to go back to the hospital. Like I needed actual support, not you trying to like, and by this point,
new devotional or listen to another sermon.
Yes. And I still have those pictures. Like I have my receipts of that because she was very strategic about what she would do in person to not get it in writing.
Right.
Like she was not qualified to do it and she wouldn't reach out to anybody to get more support about it. Later on, I found out she was talking to one of the pastors and the pastor was telling her what to do.
Yeah, because she probably had no idea at all. And this pastor was reaching into some, I don't know, maybe a leadership seminar that he had, sat through at Hillsong College.
No, he didn't go to Hillsong College. He hadn't gone.
Oh, okay. Well, even better, but still somebody who's entirely unqualified.
Yeah. So that all happens and there's like a whole bunch, like, a lot is happening at once. My mental health is not doing well. But the meds start to kind of kick in, and I start realizing a whole new world of being actually level-headed and realizing what it looks like to not have crippling anxiety and depression. I was later diagnosed with PTSD from trauma I had experienced as a kid. And my experience at Hillsong was like reliving it. So I was having like day by day reliving and having flashbacks and living in the flashbacks as I was at Hillsong because they were triggering so much of it. And no one was qualified to see it and sit me down. Like every Sunday after that, I got out of the hospital, I was having anxiety attacks. And I would have to say, I have to go. I would go to the corner, do my deep breaths. Every night on Saturday, I was like crying. Friday nights would be like the worst because the weekend was coming. So it was just like a whole shit show was happening. And no one was qualified to support me. I'm even surprised I honestly survived it all.
We live in an era of unprecedented access to information, news, and media. But what happens when all that information leads you to suddenly realize you spent the majority of your childhood in a cult? Well, we can tell you. Join me, Jessica Goforth, and Kathleen Reynolds as we take you into the world of cult recovery after all the emotional, psychological, financial, and sexual abuse we experienced as part of Bill Gothard's Advanced Training Institute. On our podcast called Leaving the Village, we talk candidly about our journey out and interview other survivors whose experiences will boggle your mind as scandals continue to rock the twisted world of IBLP. Subscribe to Leaving the Village today so you don't miss a single episode.
It got to the point where the leader was like exhausted, so she ghosted me.
Wow.
In like September started to ghost me. And in October, and she was like the only friend, quote unquote, that I thought I had.
She showed up at the hospital. One of the two people that showed up at the hospital is now ghosting you.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so then I was like, okay, I was overwhelmed with events. I was like, I should step back. So one of the pastors that Steve DeGrossa, who was looking over Connect groups, is like, hey, why don't you come and help me? And I'm like, okay, sure. Like I like admin stuff and background stuff. So he's like, let's grab coffee before we get started. I want to get to know you. And that's like trigger for something's going to happen.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's sort of a theme on our podcast. Whenever you hear somebody say, hey, let's get coffee, run away. It's a trap.
Don't go.
Why is this in everyone's story that they sit them down for coffee and it goes very wrong? This
so
is
we
something
grab
to be aware
coffee,
of.
and he's like, who's Noemi? Tell me more about you. That's a big question. So I started telling him about my family and how they were like in ministry and vocational ministry for a bit. And like my experience, and he's
but
like,
that's not what he's there to listen to, and that's not the detail he's wanting you to get into.
Yeah, no. And he's like, well, how's your mental health? And I was like, oh my God, doing so much better now that I'm on meds. My therapist is great. I have a good relationship with them, and my psychiatrist, and we're managing everything, like increasing meds because I'm like, I need more. And he's like, okay. So that was kind of the end of the first one. And then he's like, at the end, he's like, I want to mentor you.
Oh, no.
And I was like, okay, like, this is awkward. You're a white cisgendered man.
Didn't you know, Noemi, that a white cisgendered man holds the keys to all knowledge in the
Thank you for
evangelical Christian universe? They're all found in white men. It's incredible, the power and under.
Well,
it's like
it's weird.
They are default humanity. Like they understand all life experiences.
It's weird because
like
even in Christianity, or like evangelicalism, like I would expect a woman to come to me and be like, I want to mentor you, like men with men, women with women. But yeah, he was like, oh, I'm the cool pastor. I want to mentor you kind of thing, like crossing that.
Yeah. And also I'm wondering if maybe the fact that you're gay might have something to do with the fact that, you can't send a woman in to mentor this one, right? Because, you never know what might happen. Oh my God.
Yeah.
No.
So then the second meeting, I was like, sure. Yeah, whatever. The second meeting, he's like, so what's holding you back from giving it your all at church?
Oh my God.
And he's like, is there anything, like any questions you have about the church? And I was like, well, and I brought up something. I don't remember what the first thing was. I was like, there's something else. And I kind of stay quiet. He's like, it's that you're queer, right? And I was like, how do you know? Like, I've never told anybody, only my leader. And she's like, oh, I spoke with her.
Yep.
He's like, when you were having a hard time with your mental health, she would reach out to me and I was supporting her.
Cool. So you're getting outed.
Yeah.
Behind your back, non-consensually. Lovely. So you're sitting there with Steve DeGroza, and he wants to mentor you. He lets you know that he has found out that you're queer.
Without your consent.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. Okay.
Yeah. So then we start getting into it, or he at least asked me what about that was holding me back from giving it my all. And I was like, well, like, I haven't gotten a straight answer of what Hillsong believes, and I need to understand in order to know where I'm at. I was like, I've been questioning if this is at this point, I was like, I'm questioning if this is actually a place for me. And if it's not, I can't be here. And he's like, well, like, you know, we welcome all people and it's a case by case basis. I was like, okay, fine. I've already got this question. I've already got this response. Here are a few questions for me. And this is now coming from a person, myself, who felt more firm in what I believed in queer theology. And I had already heard how to ask questions to pastors that are like this. So I asked him, I was like, okay, great. Yes or no questions. Would you, as a pastor who is ordained, I'm assuming you're ordained so you can marry people. Would you, as a pastor, marry me and my partner who happens to be of the same sex? And he kind of just stays quiet. He's like, well, Hillsong Church doesn't really perform marriages for just anybody. Like,
of course,
it's on a special case.
Case by case scenario.
Yeah. And I was like, come on, Steve, you're my friend, aren't you? And he's like, well, yeah, we're friends. I was like, okay, well, you as
what
my
if I
friend.
asked you?
And I come to you and I say, Steve, as an supposedly ordained minister, because I don't know what your qualifications are for you to call yourself a pastor, would you marry my partner and I who happens to be of the same sex? He's like, well, no, I can't do that. I'm like, okay, thank you. Like, that's all I needed to hear. Would you, would Hillsong Church, if something were to be posted about a job and I read it and I'm like, oh my God, I'm the perfect candidate for this. I qualify and overqualify. And I apply for this job as an openly queer person, would Hillsong Church hire me? He's like, well, we don't know who's going to apply. And if you
No, that's
get
not
the
what I
job.
asked. That's not
And I
what
was
I
like,
asked.
no, like, would I get the job saying that I'm an openly queer person? And maybe I also happen to be married to someone of the same sex. And he's like, well, no. And I'm like, okay, why?
You got some final straight answers.
Yeah. He's like, I was like, well, why? He's like, well, you know, because we as leaders believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. And so then whoever is hired needs to have those same belief systems. And I'm like,
And
why
no one
didn't
could have
I
said
know
this
Yeah.
any
Why is this
point
not up front?
before.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
You have asked the question already. They could have said that a long time ago. Like,
And
why
he-
say case by case when they could have given you that answer before?
Exactly. And he's like, well, and he knew he had fucked up. So he's like, but we can bring Carl in and we can have a conversation. He'll come down here and talk to you. He's like, I can text him right now. Like, I don't want to talk to Carl. First of all, this guy
You've
is
given
super
me enough
manipulative.
information.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, no, he's super manipulative. He's going to swindle his way into trying to convince me to get back into it. I'm okay. Like, I know his game. I've seen him. Like, I know how to tell pastors that are that way. Yeah, he's super charismatic speaker, but no, thank you. And he's like, well, I know there's a group of gay people who meet in New York. Maybe I can connect you with some of them. At the time, I didn't know what that meant. Now I know that it was the gay meeting that happened in 2015 that Janice told me about later on, like this year, actually.
The backlash to Josh Canfield.
Yes. Yes. And so then I was like, no, I'm okay. Like, this conversation.
Also, New York? Really?
Yeah.
You're in Boston.
Oh, no. He would make me go over there. I went to New York on my own because I needed to get training for events. Yeah. Like, we would leave right after the 1 p.m. service in Boston, finish up until like 3 or 4 p.m., drive to New York to the last service to volunteer, and come back. Didn't get home till like 3 a.m.
How many hours is that from
probably
Boston
like 4 hours driving, and
drive.
if there's traffic, 5.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Back and forth.
Hey, you can have a sense of community 5 hours away.
He was telling me that, and I was like, no. And I was like, honestly, this conversation is like really making me reconsider if this is a place for me. His alarm rang because we had to go to this thing, and he's like, oh, we have to go, let's go. I was like, oh, saved by the bell. So after that conversation, he's like, okay, let's schedule our next one. So we schedule it, doesn't show up.
He doesn't show up?
He doesn't show up.
Oh my God.
I text him, I call him, everything, nothing. And he texts me the day later. Oh, I'm so sorry. No, like this day, I'll be there. The day comes, he doesn't show up. The following day, it was getting wet, like 4 times.
And you had been ghosted by your other leader, and now this guy's taking you under the guy up from her.
The guy who was going to mentor me.
Wow.
Is now like also ghosting me and not showing up to like our mentorship meetings. He
can message you if he can't show up to say, hey, sorry, something came up. Can I, he could have let you know instead of having you. He would excuse it on like, oh, the snow, or, oh, I'm working on this. I was like, okay, but you could have told me beforehand. Right. So I didn't travel in the snow to get there. But he wasn't doing any of that. And I don't know why I showed up 4 times.
Wow.
And was stood up 4 times. And it got to the last one that I texted him, and I was like, I'm done with this mentorship thing. Like, this is, you're a shitty person. You're a shitty pastor. Yeah. And that Sunday after,
sorry, I'm like, yep.
That Sunday, I'm heading in the train home, and I'm crying, and there's luckily no one else in the train, but no one really cares if you cry in the train here either.
Yeah.
I'm crying, and I stop myself, and I'm like, why is it that every Sunday that I head home, I cry on Saturday because I don't want to go to church, and then I'm crying on Sunday after church because I'm exhausted and because I didn't want to be there.
So messed up.
And my body had already told me I didn't want to be there. Like, I ended up in the psychiatric hospital. Like, what the fuck am I doing? And I was like, what if I try to not go one Sunday? What would that feel like? And I get home, and then the following weekend, I text my friend. I'm like, I'm not going to church. Can we do something else? Keep me busy. So we hang out, and we go shopping and do different things. And I don't tell anybody that I'm not going. I just don't show up. I think I texted Steve for the 5 p.m. and I tell him, hey, I can't make it. I'm so sorry. Because I was actually being responsible and doing that.
Yeah.
You actually let the person know that you're going to be a no-show. Wow.
Yeah.
Just common basic
I was helping him table for Connect groups, and I couldn't show up for the 5 p.m. And I was like,
you're treating him like a normal human being that cares about someone else.
Yeah.
You would just be courteous.
With a little respect at the
just
bare
a
minimum, right?
Bare minimum respect. Let them know.
Yeah. And so I don't show up. And then the following Sunday again. And so I ended up texting him one day. I was like, I'm done. Like, I can't do this anymore. I'm tired. And I go home for the holidays. So like Christmas and New Year. No, just Christmas. I come back for New Year's. And he was leaving for Sydney to go to Hillsong College. And it was his last Sunday. And it was another friend's last Sunday who was also leaving. And I was like, I'm just going to go and say bye. I don't know why I did it. I go to church December 29th. And I sit on the side. I didn't volunteer. I didn't do anything. I just sat there, listened to whoever was speaking, and I was like, this isn't a good sermon. This is like nothing.
This is what I was missing out when I was making this thing work. I didn't even know what I was helping put out there.
I had listened to one or two things, but I didn't really digest a lot of it until this time. I was like, nothing is theological. Nothing is theologically correct about what you're telling me. One. And it was just shitty. Like, it wasn't good. And after the service, I approached Steve to say bye, and he gives me a card. Like, he wrote something for me, like, because he was my friend, supposedly. And he asked me, like, hey, it was just him, his wife, and myself. And he's like, how are you doing? And I was like, good. I haven't been going to church. I'm living my best life.
Great since I quit church. It's been the
my
best
mental
decision
health
I've ever.
is so much better. And he's like, oh, that's so sad that you're like not coming to church. And I'm like, why is that sad? Like, I'm good. And he's like, well, are you going to find another church? And I was like, I don't know. Like, not right now. I don't feel the need to. And he was like, well, you're always welcome here. You know, this is your home. And I was like, no, correction. A home is where someone is wholly welcome for who they are, wholeheartedly. Here, I am not fully welcome. The welcome home sign has terms and conditions for someone like me.
Yeah.
And he kind of just stays quiet. And I was like, that's not a home. That's just a house. And he kind of just stays there. And I was like, okay. And I was like, I have to go. Because at that point, my leader was approaching. Because she was also going to say bye to him. I was like, I don't want to see her fucking face. I had the decency after that service to text her and say, hey, I left Hillsong, just FYI. Like, don't contact me, don't text me kind of thing. And so I get up and leave. And I walk out. And I ended up going again in February, but no, like as a visitor. And I would sit next to the stage managers because I knew them.
Yeah.
And they would be like, hey, I saved you a seat next to me. I was like, okay, fine. And I went for, in February for the Black History Month in 2020. The first time they ever actually did something that was, and they gave me a seat, and Josh saw me, and he messaged me later. He's like, hey, it was great to see you at church. It's like the person who never fucking showed up to anything is now DMing me saying it was great to see you at church.
Because you're gone and you showed up after being gone.
Yeah. And so after that, I was like, oh, open door. So I messaged him back and I was like, it's kind of shitty that as someone who was there from the start, literally from the start of Wednesday services, helped you build this church on your vision, because it's your vision as the pastor of this local campus, that you would never have the decency to never tell me the stance of Hillsong Church. You could have saved this headache. But yet, like, you
guys
kept
were
it going.
fucking with my life.
Yeah. I was like, you couldn't even say a goodbye. You couldn't even go to the hospital. And he messages me back. He's like, I'm not going to respond to this. The only thing I'm going to say is that we loved you and please give the church the same grace we gave you in return.
Oh my God. What grace?
Oh man, you're like, if I give you the same grace you gave me, you don't want to see what that. I like the expression.
And I ran with
I love the expression. Have the day you deserve.
Yeah. So and he mentioned something about, I thought you were talking with your leader. And I was like, so you did know that I was talking with her.
Wow.
And so I talked to her as a friend. And for her to be like also going to other people, like, I'm glad she did get the support she needed if she needed at the time. But she should have been transparent with me and told me who things were being disclosed and what. And
they were all aware, and so they all had a responsibility. And the kind of messages she was giving to you, no one can say, "Oh, that was just her," because she was in contact with the leader above her and with the main leader, who was the head of the whole thing. Like, she was in contact with all of them.
Yeah,
and that
so
kind of just confirmed to you they were all aware.
Yeah, I realized they're all aware. This is a full-on pattern. And it was really, really frustrating to see that. So later on in 2020, I ended up posting something and I tagged someone. Do Better Church was starting. And they shared a story from Hillsong LA where the leader had to out, or the pastor was asking a leader to out the volunteers that were gay because he wanted to mentor them.
Oh my God.
And I was like, wait, is this a pattern? Like, is this something that Hillsong does? So I posted and I was like, wait, they did this to me in Boston. They tried to mentor me. And all I was told is that, like, no, like, it's a case-by-case basis. And when I left, I was told that I was loved. What fucking love? And that they had given me the grace, that I should give the grace in return that they gave me. And I was like, and Carl over here was saying that we only talk about what we're for, not what we're against. So the fact that he's not talking about it is telling me that he's against it. And I tagged Carl and Josh Kimes. Josh Kimes quickly, like, blocks me. No, I tag him in a few things later and then he blocks me.
Oh, okay.
But then Carl ends up, like, seeing it and other people start messaging him about it. And I become the Boston situation within emails about what was happening here. And in the emails, it says, like, oh, well, she was already on her way out. That's the hit that everyone gives when they're leaving. And I was like, I was a fucking leader building this. Like, I was in it. I was part of events, like, helping you day in and day out, like, during the week, doing all these things. And yet you're discarding me as, like, oh, she was on her way out, whatever. And so that was really eye-opening for me after I had left, because I was still, when you leave, sometimes you still have a tug to go back. And that for me was what made it so that the tug was ripped, was like cut, and I didn't feel the need to go back anymore. Like seeing what Carl was saying about me and what Josh had already done through text, that I screenshotted and posted it. And people were like messaging, like, thank you for outing him. He's so fucked up. Like, he's like a shitty person. He was like gaslighting me in messages too. And that was kind of like what pushed it forward. And later on in 2020, I ended up talking to reporters. I was part of the Business Insider article, and then more articles started coming out. When the article for Business Insider came out, Brian Houston responded in a tweet saying, oh, the media talks, there's gossipers speaking, but like they don't know the truth, something like that. And so I responded and I was like, nobody told me, the media didn't tell me, gossipers didn't tell me, I experienced it as an events lead and as a Connect group leader. And it almost killed me. And he quickly deleted the tweet after that. Like I was quoted later because of that. And then once that article came out of the tweets of his and mine, he quickly deleted it. And that for me was like starting to see now Brian. Now I was starting to see the chain.
Yep. You just kept seeing higher up and you're like, okay, it's bad at the closest level to me. What about above her? Oh, it's bad at the level above her. What about above him? It's bad at the level above him, the pastor of your local church. What about, the one above him, the NYC branch head leader? Oh, it's bad here. Yeah. What about the head of the whole freaking thing? Yeah. How is it? And it's the same
trickle effect. Yeah. And then
what is it like? What is it like for you when you hear people try and talk about Hillsong right now? Like, oh, it's an isolated thing and there's so much good and it's not the whole thing. It's not the whole thing. How does that feel? How does that resonate inside of you?
It's frustrating because I thought I was a singled out. I thought I was a one and off. And then when I heard what happened in LA, I was like, there's something more systemic here. And then I heard later on two of my friends who I knew were gay within Hillsong Boston. We had our own little like group that no one knew about, and we would meet and talk and grab coffee. they later told me they were being also mentored by Steve DeGrossa, and they were being told that they were gay because they had problems with their dad. And that they should just go and hook up with a girl or something and realize what it was like. Things like that. Like, it was shitty.
Okay, so people who are listening to this are probably aghast because, you know, it's an evangelical church and they're advocating, you know, that these guys hook up with the girl to, you know, the thing about Hillsong was that there was a lot of, you know, the double speak, right? Like you had, you know, pastors talking about you know, being faithful and not having sex, you know, outside of marriage. But if you knew anybody in any level of service and leadership, you knew nobody was holding to those standards at all, and they knew. So behind closed doors, they would make those kinds of comments.
Yeah, one-on-one they would.
Yeah, but from the platform, oh, they're towing the evangelical line.
Mm-hmm.
You know, no sex outside of marriage. But behind the scenes, if it suits them, they're going to use.
Yeah.
You know, oh, well, you just sleep with a girl. That'll fix this.
Yeah. And it made me realize why they kept asking about my parents, because they thought I had a bad relationship with them. And I was like, no, like, now I just don't talk to my mom as often because we're trying to work through this of me coming out. And now, like, my mom's fully affirming, and she, like, left her church because of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Like, there's a lot of people where they don't get that. And
Yeah.
I'm happy that you do have the privilege of having a mom. Like, that's so huge.
Yeah.
That's such a big deal.
I feel very privileged because even in March of 2020, when I went to go visit her for her birthday, I surprised her. She had gone to a conference that morning, women's conference, and she went up to the stage. I didn't know this about her. She went up to the stage because they were asking if anyone wanted to say anything. And she grabbed the mic and said, in front of like thousands of women, said, "We need to love gay people more." She's like, my daughter.
What was that like for you? What was that
I didn't
like?
find out about this till like a year later. She said, in the church, we're pushing people away. My daughter is gay, and I saw what it was like for me to push her away. And we need to do better. She's like, I don't know what I believe in about this, and I'm working through it, but she's still my daughter, and we need to do better. And everyone shunned her after that. But she was like, I have my family. I don't care.
Oh.
So for me, hearing that a year later, it was really surprising because I didn't know where she was at. She wasn't telling me much of where she was at in the process of like understanding or learning more about LGBTQ people and identities.
I'm so happy for her.
Yeah.
I'm just so happy.
And it really, it brought tears to my eyes when I heard about that, because it was like, okay, she was listening.
Yeah.
The moments when I thought she was just yelling at me, or just, she would randomly just start crying on the phone, like 2 seconds into us on the phone. And I would have to be like, nope, I had to set my boundaries. Like, if you're going to be crying, I cannot be on the phone with you until you can calm down. Then you can call me back. And to know that actually worked. And for my sisters to also like step up and tell her to stop, to actually listen. And for my aunts to also step in and be like, what the fuck are you doing? You're pushing your daughter away. Like, all these people around me that I didn't know were helping
behind
me.
the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
We're trying to build and support you and make sure that your mom could come around to being a supportive mommy of you. Oh.
So that
what was that like for you to like have that conversation and realize she was affirming and realize she'd changed her mind and all the stuff that had gone on in the background? What was that like?
Now I've seen the thing with my mom. She had lost her identity in who she was because of my dad. We had grown up in a church that was like pushing women. Women had to be silent. And for her, after my dad passed, she didn't know who she was. She had an identity crisis. And for her to find herself and now see that her children are also finding themselves, and it's turning out to be way different than what she expected. She kind of had to sit down and realize that. And for me, that was like very eye-opening to see the growth that she was going through. It's gotten to the point where now my other sister who was questioning came out, and my mom hasn't had the conversation with her, but I've been like mitigating it between them, because they're starting to like want to talk about it. Because it was really like, her story is her story, and I'm not going to say anything, but it was really difficult. Like that closeted me a lot. That probably happened when I was like 17. I didn't come out till like 4 years later because of that. And I had to be far away. So yeah.
Oh, I'm so happy for the healing work that's begun in your
so
family.
Despite everything that happened at Hillsong, and the pain and the anger that I felt there, and the exclusion and the terms and conditions that I had to read between the lines because they weren't explicit. On the other hand, I was going through a process with my family and learning with them, because I was learning about myself as I was going through it, and realizing that I do have a family, and even if it wasn't also my blood family, I also had chosen family that I found afterwards. It gets better.
Yeah.
And even if it's not the way that you thought it's going to be, like it gets better.
Yeah. Wow.
You know, when we had Janice on our episode and we're on our Hillsong kick, and we're, Nate's processing leaving. And it's funny, he's left in 2007 before you even entered in. But these places leave a mark on you. And that's why we're covering it. We know that there are people who are still many years later going, what the heck happened? And as they see the stories break, it brings everything fresh, just back to the surface. And the documentary that you were in that just broke brings everything back to the surface. So we're revisiting and talking, and we had Janice on, and we had just watched a documentary. And by the way, Nate broke down after hearing you talk at the end. That's the part where when you were talking about how hard it was, I think they asked you a question at the end that was like personal about how does it feel now? And there was some shame mixed in with that. And I wish I feel a little embarrassed, or I don't know how you worded yourself about it all, of like just buying into everything and then seeing how it turned. And they didn't give your story. But anyway, Nate, I'll get back to that. But Nate goes, like, he just resonated with what you said at the end. And I think a lot of people right now, people who are listening, some are coming out of Hillsong and trying to process and are listening to any episodes that people are covering on podcasts dealing with Hillsong. And we want to talk about that. We know there's a need there. But also, it's common. These threads are common in evangelical culture, and people feel embarrassed years later and are still dealing with the trauma and like, how did I get sucked into all this? And this was nuts. This was bad for my mental health. How was I so, and Nate resonated with your feelings, and thank you for that transparency and that vulnerability of expressing that. And to everyone who's there, that's normal. And there's hope on the other side of that. When we talked to Janice, I was like, Janice, the one beef I had with the documentary, I said this to her. This is how we ended up. I'm like, okay, gotta get Noemi on the show. Because she started saying, when I said to her, I'm annoyed that like they underused you for I watched the doc 3 hours long. I had heard enough of Janice's story through listening to her podcast, because she does a lot on social media talking about Hillsong, and it's she's entertaining. She's like listening to politics from a late night comedian. Easy way to digest all the trauma. She'll take you through the honesty of it, but she'll do it in a way that's lighthearted and makes you laugh at the absurdity of it. And I listening to so much of her Hillsong stuff, and I went, oh man, she has such rich stories, and listening to her podcast. And I'm like, I'm annoyed at the Hillsong documentary. In 3 hours, did they cover a lot? Yes. Did they cover really important stuff? Yes. Did they cover a lot of the meat of it? Yes. Did they barely scratch the surface? Yes. Yeah. And part of that for me was seeing how they used you in that documentary, and I'm annoyed that they underused you. And the first thing she said was, Noemi was very underused. I'm not the only one. Her story, her entire story was just not really told at all. And I thank you so much for coming to actually share what you had gone through there, because again, I feel like maybe that's the story of a lot of people at Hillsong, is like, there's just so many stories and there's so much going on that's really messed up. And I guess I'm going to wrap up with a thought that was on my head. I saw today someone say,
stop trying to get a seat at a table that Jesus overturned. And I was just like, wow, because I was reading that Casting Crowns and a bunch of other people were supposed to be doing a Hillsong concert together, and Hillsong was the one that backed out. And I was annoyed because I'm like, this is such a ploy. Of course, Hillsong acted like they were backing out to recover from and take care of our community. Meanwhile, the other people are like, we're going to lose ticket sales if you don't back out. So like, please back out, right? We don't want to distance ourselves from you because in case this connection is useful in the future, whatever deals we have behind closed doors financially, we don't want to say that's our reason. So you just back out and this looks better for all of us. And I mean, the way that I picked up on that, and again, can I prove anything that I'm saying? No. This is what I've seen from evangelical cultures. All speculation. I'm acknowing I have no insider knowledge.
And they're
this is what I'm
very good
assuming.
about not getting it in writing.
Yeah.
Right. But what I did see on the website was Casting Crowns talking about how much they support Hillsong and love and want their best. And I'm like, when you see this kind of corruption and you act like they're a great organization, that says something about you. And I'm seeing that all over evangelicalism. Like when people are aligning with Hillsong still, I'm like, either you're completely ignorant, which there's no excuse for this. You can go watch a document. There's so many Hillsong documentaries. The one you're in is not the only one, but if I'm going to recommend one, I think that one is the most comprehensive I've seen to date. But there have been others before. The fact that there are so many speaks to the culture of how messed up things have gotten at Hillsong. But like for any evangelical organizations to still affiliate or saying something about themselves. And when I saw that quote about stop trying to get a seat at the table that Jesus overturned, I'm like, yes. All of these Christians that are still trying to be like, but there's good at Hillsong and Jesus has turned over that table. He is showing that this is corruption, that this is gross. Yeah. And if you're ignoring that and you're like, let's pray God's going to do a great thing, grace, something good happened with my kid when they listened to Hillsong music one time. So we're going to disregard everyone and all the victims and all the corruption in the whole organization and just focus on that one good part of it. To add
Hillsong lingo to that, we're trying to sit at the Hillsong merch table in the welcome lounge. And Jesus already overturned it.
The merch table in the welcome lounge. Oh, God.
I so appreciate
well, at least we're not all trying to claw for the green room, right?
Oh my God. Where the actual food is at?
Yeah, where the actual food is at.
Did they have a green room in Boston?
They did.
Of course they did. Of course they did.
It's
everywhere.
Yep.
This thing
it's
is
the culture.
Everywhere.
I would sneak in there during service and everyone was like in and I would like grab something.
Oh yeah. That's how I ended up with these stickers.
You can't see this. You guys can't see this. But it is a special sticker that Nate got on his Bible. That is a Hillsong merch sticker. That's it's not given on the merch tables.
The green room
not given
was,
out to the average
empty.
people.
Right. We'll probably cut this part out, but yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Noemi, for joining us.
Thank you for having me and for listening.
I really appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty, and I hope that if you're listening to this, that you'll take some of this to heart. That these organizations that we talk about on our podcast, there are no two ways about it. They're corrupt, and they are hurting people, and there's no redeeming qualities here. It's all bathwater. There's no baby. All right.
Yeah.
So.
There's no saving a baby. It's not in there. It's left. It's turning over their tables.
No. Exactly.
That wraps up another episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. And if you don't already have one, head over to our website, fullmutuality.com, for a list of all the apps you can find us on.
We couldn't do this without you, our listeners, so thank you so much for your continued support. Speaking of support, one of the best things you can do for us is to head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review.
I'm pretty sure 5-star reviews get you an extra crown in heaven.
Look, seriously, if you found this episode insightful, spread the word and share it with your friends.
And don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Full Mutuality. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast.